Hello, and welcome to week 5 of high school mythology. So, this week we are going to be focusing on 4 heroes. So, we'll go ahead and get this slide pulled up. So, Perseus, Theseus, Hercules, and Atalanta. We'll spend the majority of this lecture focusing on Perseus and Theseus, comparing and contrasting the two and looking at how their stories represent the hero's journey that we talked about last week. So I'm going to go ahead and take us to this next slide. So in your reading, you know that Perseus is sent to complete this seemingly impossible task, right? To go and bring back the head of Medusa. So we'll start with this, and you'll notice also here in the middle where we have this representation, right? This visual for the hero's journey. Again, this idea put forth by Joseph Campbell in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. So as we're talking, or as I'm talking, right, and you're listening, you can follow along and see where we are in the cycle and how each of these characters fits into this cycle. So Theseus, he defeats the Minotaur and saves his kingdom from forever having to send tributes, right, to get eaten up by that Minotaur. So we'll look at them at the same time and kind of compare each step of their journey with the other. So they start off, right, in the ordinary world. And for the ordinary world, Perseus and his mother, Danae, are living on the island of Seriphus, and the king wants to marry Danae, so he wants to get Perseus out of the way. Then we have Theseus, who is living his ordinary life as the son of Aegeus, who is the king of Athens. However, Theseus is sent away and told to return at the time in which he is mature enough to fit the role that has been designated for him. So we see how both of them are just kind of living an ordinary life, right? Then they receive this call to adventure. So Polydectes, the king, tells Perseus to bring back the head of Medusa. So, in a similar way to what we've seen before, this hero is given a task by a king in which the king feels like the hero is not going to make it back alive. And Polydectes, of course, wants to marry Danae. And in order to do that, he must get Perseus, her son, out of the way. So he decides he'll send him on this quest to bring back the head of Medusa and thinks he will not be successful in doing so. Then for Theseus, after a war has taken place with Crete, Theseus's home city of Athens has to pay tribute to King Minos, who is the king of Crete. And they have to do this by sending tributes to the labyrinth every 9 years. This may sound familiar to you also if you are a fan of the Hunger Games, this idea of sending tributes, right, to be sacrificed. We see this here. And Suzanne Collins, the author of the Hunger Games, is heavily influenced by mythology, both Greek and Roman. So you may start to see some familiar characteristics, as one of our questions was at the beginning of this class, right? To kind of think about some of the more modern stories that fit into similar themes to what these myths do. So that's just something you can keep in mind. Then they both have this next step where they have mentors or helpers along the way on their journey. So for Perseus, he has the help of Athena and Hermes. So Athena gives him that shield, and Hermes gives him the winged sandals, right, which will both benefit Perseus as he defeats Medusa. And then the mentor for Theseus would be his father, right? His father says, when you come back, I want you to put up white sails if you survived after, going through the labyrinth. If not, put up black sails. Unfortunately, we'll see what happens there when we get to that point in a little while. And they next step is to cross that threshold. So for Perseus, the crossing of the threshold would be when he blackmails the Gray, right? The sisters who share one eye. They don't want to tell him how to find the nymphs. So he has been told to take their eye, right, when they're passing it back and forth. And he does this and he says, okay, I'll give you this eye back once you tell me where to find the nymphs so I can continue on my journey so that I can defeat Medusa and bring back her head. So the threshold crossing for Theseus is when he volunteers as tribute. So he leaves Athens and he crosses the sea to the island of Crete, where the Minotaur is housed in the labyrinth. Then each of them goes through these tests. They meet allies along the way. They meet enemies along the way, certainly. So Perseus faces the test of finding the location of the nymphs, right? And he's successful, as we just mentioned, in doing this because the sisters, the Gray, end up telling him so they can get their eye back. The allies also would be the nymphs once he reaches them, right? Because they loan him the winged sandals of Hermes and also the helmet of invisibility and the bag in which he can put Medusa's head. And also, he gets help from Athena with her shield, as we mentioned. And additionally, the enemies, of course, that he meets would be the Gorgons, especially Medusa, but also the other two as well. And then for Theseus, as he goes on his journey, he too has tests and he meets up with allies as well as enemies. So Ariadne, who again, we see this kind of similar theme where we have the daughter of the king helping the hero. Ariadne helps Theseus. She gives him a sword and she provides him with a spool of thread because Ariadne goes to Daedalus, who we mentioned last week, right? The inventor who designed the labyrinth, and asks him, how can someone safely get out of the labyrinth? And so Daedalus tells her that you would take a spool of thread, right? And as you're going in, you make sure to unspool that thread so that way you can follow it back out. So the test, of course, for Theseus would be to enter into this labyrinth and defeat the Minotaur. And enemies for Theseus would be, of course, King Minos, right? Because he wants to, kind of put these kids in this situation, these tributes where they will die. And also the Minotaur. Although in some ways you kind of can feel some compassion for the Minotaur a little bit too, but still the Minotaur would, of course, be an enemy of Theseus. Then they approach the cave. So this is a literal cave, right, for Perseus, where he literally has to go into where Medusa and the other Gorgons are. And then it can be figurative too. This idea of the cave is going to be that darkest, that hardest place, the abyss, it's sometimes referred to as we see it here in this particular visual representation. So that abyss, that cave, that darkest part of the journey. So as we mentioned, Perseus has to literally go into the cave to defeat Medusa. And the approaching of the cave, of course, for Theseus is in the form of the labyrinth, right? Going into that most dangerous place. Then they go through the ordeal, right? Perseus, of course, successfully chops off the head of Medusa. He gets pursued by her sisters, and he escapes safely because he has the winged sandals and the helmet of invisibility. For Theseus, his ordeal, of course, is to battle the Minotaur, and he successfully does that and kills him, and then is able to follow that thread, right, to safely come out of the labyrinth. The reward for Perseus is Medusa's head, right? And he also gets Princess Andromeda's hand in marriage. Then for Theseus, his reward is he rescues the Athenians, right? They don't have to send tributes anymore. And he is able to take Ariadne, the princess, with him. On the road back, Perseus flies back home with the head of Medusa, and he has it in that special bag. For Theseus, on his way back home, on his journey to home, his ship stops at an island of Naxos, and Ariadne gets left behind. Some say, according to certain versions of the myth, that it was accidental. Others say that it was intentional. But at any rate, she is left behind. And there are some versions too that say Dionysus comes and finds her there, and then they live, happily in love together. Then after that, road back, you have the resurrection. And that's not always going to be like literally resurrecting from death to life. It can have other meanings, such as for Perseus, in his case, his resurrection would be saving his mother, Danae, who he finds out, once he gets back, is going to be forced into this marriage. He also, when he sees the king and all of the king's men, not Humpty Dumpty, right? All of the king's men, Perseus turns, of course, his face away, but then he pulls Medusa's head up out of the bag. And even though it's just her head, it still turns men into stone. So therefore, he's able to completely defeat the king and the king's followers and rescue his mother. For Theseus, the Aegean Sea is named after his father, King Aegeus. Unfortunately, we talked about a moment ago that King Aegeus told Theseus, if you're coming back alive, please make sure you put up the white sails of celebration, not the black sails of mourning. But Theseus forgot to change it out. So as the ship approaches and his father sees the black sails, he thinks that Theseus has died. And so he throws himself into the water, and dies in that way. But then the sea is named after him, the Aegean Sea. So again, a myth explaining, right, natural occurrences are the names of places. Then they return with the elixir, right? That can sometimes literally be some kind of elixir or potion, or it can be figurative, like we see in the stories of Perseus and Theseus. So this elixir for Perseus would be salvation for his mother, right? He's able to save her from that cruel king. For Theseus, the elixir of life is that he becomes king of Athens. So a couple of other things that I wanted to mention is just to ask too, what do you think makes Theseus a perfect hero for Athens? Think about what we know about Athens and think about the characteristics and the traits of Theseus. And why do you think that he is the perfect hero for Athens? And Medusa's story. There are different variations to the myth of Medusa. Some of them say that Medusa was a beautiful young woman who Poseidon forced into an act in the temple of Athena, if you get what I'm saying. And Athena was so angered by this defilement that she punished Medusa, although it wasn't Medusa's fault, punished her by turning her into this monster and making it so that she would turn man to stone with her, her look. So those are just some couple of other ideas about Medusa. So we won't spend a whole lot of time talking about each individual task for Hercules, but I just want to mention again, here we have the case of Zeus involving himself with a mortal woman, and then Hera taking it out on that woman and the child who was a result of the union. And it certainly wasn't this woman's fault because Zeus disguised himself as her husband. However, you can't talk logic with Hera, right? So she punishes Hercules. First of all, she tries to kill him by sending snakes when he's an infant, but he is able to successfully kill them. Unfortunately, his strength is so strong, or that even sorry, his strength is so powerful, and he doesn't even realize how strong he is, and he ends up accidentally killing one of his teachers. He's able to, as a youth, with his bare hands, right, kill a lion, and then he goes around wearing that coat. He defeats the Manaeans and marries Megara. Unfortunately, Hera, again, we see punishing Hercules, causes him to go mad for a brief amount of time. And in that time, he kills his wife, Megara, and their children. So again, too, this kind of goes back to the question we had at the beginning, where Edith Hamilton argues that these Greek myths are not, barbaric like some of the others were before this time. Excuse me, this is pretty barbaric, right? So Hercules feels that he must complete some kind of penance, right? Some kind of repayment for everything that he's done. So he's given these 12 labors, which he successfully completes. Then he ends up, after everything happens, being tricked, or his wife is tricked, right? Because he falls in love with someone else. And she was told by this very untrustworthy source of how to make Hercules fall back in love with her. But of course, that is not what this does. Instead, it makes Hercules to begin to be in serious pain, because he is invincible except through magic, and this is magic. And so in order to not have to deal with this anymore, he does end up dying. And Hera, at this point, after all of this, right, they have a truce, and she allows him to come and reside on Mount Olympus. So a little too little too late in a lot of ways for Hercules, but Hera finally, chills out a bit about it. And then Atalanta, she is featured in the Hesiodic catalog of women. She's known as the greatest female hero. She took part in the Caledonian Hunt, which angered some of the men. She was the first one to strike the boar, and then another man came alongside and dealt it the final blow. But then that man's uncles were very angry because Atalanta, this woman, right, was being praised and getting attention for her role. So they start, being disrespectful, and the man who came alongside Atalanta and dealt that devastating fatal blow to the boar, he gets angry and kills his uncles. Well, then his mother gets angry at him because he's killed her brothers. So she burns up the log, which represents his life, and he ends up dying as a result. Then Atalanta's got many, many suitors. But again, like we've seen in the case with Daphne and Arethusa and some of the others, Atalanta does not want to get married. She wants to be single, free, and independent. However, to kind of, keep her suitors calm, she says that she will marry anyone who is able to beat her in a foot race. No one should be able to do that. However, you have a man, right, comes along with these golden apples, and he throws them down as he and Atalanta are racing so that she will be all caught up, right, and admiring these golden apples. Again, with the apples, right? It's always apples. And next week we'll see another story that features apples, right? This temptation. So she indeed gets distracted by the apples. This man is able to win the race, and then she ends up having to marry him. And then at some point, they do something that angers Zeus, and he turns her into a lioness and him into a lion. So be sure that you look on the classroom page and answer the questions about the stories as well as the artwork and poetry. So have a wonderful rest of your day or night whenever you're watching this, and I will see you soon, or you'll see me, as I say. Bye.